If I could ask everyone to please come forward and be seated, we'd like to get started with our afternoon program. I'm not helpful, are I? I hope everyone had a good lunch. And it's good to combine knowledge with good food. So, to begin this afternoon, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Carrie Exton. I'm envious because she lives in Paris. Dr. Exton leads the Monitoring Well-Being and Progress section at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which I will refer to as OECD. Based in the Statistics and Data Directorate, her work is focused on measuring, reporting, and analyzing data about people's well-being, their inequality, and sustainability, particularly from an international perspective. She is the main editor and coordinator for the OECD's flagship well-being report called How is Life? And she oversees the team's work on well-being framework and indicators, Sustainable Development Goals, Better Life Index website, and the policy applications of well-being metrics. Prior to joining OECD in 2011, Dr. Exton worked as a policy advisor in the UK civil service, including roles in strategy, private office, higher education, research, and science policy, and the apprenticeship unit. She holds a PhD in experimental psychology from Oxford University, and I'm most interested in her work on inequality because I think that is something that we really need to be thinking about in relation to infrastructure and happiness. So please welcome Dr. Exton to the podium.
Afternoon, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the introduction. It saves me the job of explaining who I am and why I'm here. I have to apologize that compared to Ricardo's presentation, this is very low-tech. So you're going to have to excuse my very 90s PowerPoint slides and my very analog rather than digital data. But seeing as we're starting in the post-lunch session and everybody might be feeling a little bit drowsy and very comfortable, and those of you who've traveled from Europe or the Middle East are just entering that kind of twilight zone of the jet lag where you're not really sure what's going on anymore, I thought I'd start us with a really easy topic. What is happiness? So Oberlin touched on this earlier on in her presentation, and I think it's worth digging into this in a little bit more detail. Now, you might be feeling like the topic of what is happiness is something that is really best left to philosophers, and you may be right about that, although I notice on the program that we have two preeminent Carols who are going to be talking to us over the course of the 2 days, Carol Riff and Carol Graham, who I think could give any philosopher a run for his money in terms of this question. So I wouldn't want to limit it to the philosophers. And indeed, I don't think we can limit this to a philosophical debate. My interest is in public policy, and if you want to use a concept to guide public policy, it's really essential that you are open and transparent in what you mean by that concept. And ideally, you'd be able to measure that concept because you want to be able to make your policies evidence-based. So I'm from the Statistics Directorate, as already been mentioned, and we focus on the measurement side of happiness, or as we often call it, well-being. Why do we do it? Well, we do it primarily because policymakers need feedback. They need to know if life is getting better and for whom life is getting better. They need to know where are the biggest opportunities to raise people's well-being, where can they have the sort of biggest bang for their buck. And they need to know which policies actually work, so which policies help to make life better. But this isn't just about policymakers. It's also about the rest of us, so whether that's civil society or the media or businesses or citizens. We all need information partly to hold policymakers to account for the promises that they make to us, but also to inform our own decisions and the way that we participate in society. So while I kind of have this policy lens to my work, I do think that these data are important for society, not just for certain groups within it. Now, everybody likes a simple story. And one of the tendencies that we've found is that when something is very measurable, we tend to focus on it. And I think it's fair to say that policy, research, and the media have all gotten a bit preoccupied with this number on the screen here, which is GDP, gross domestic product. GDP is very measurable. In fact, we've been spending the last 85 years making sure that we're really good at measuring it. There's an enormous amount of effort and activity gone on into making sure that these are good, robust, valid, reliable data. So that's kind of setting a benchmark for what we're aiming for in terms of having good data that is internationally comparable. But of course, measures like GDP were never designed to capture concepts like happiness. It's a measure of economic production. It's not a measure of what that brings to society. So we need to broaden out the picture. Again, I don't want to spend too long on kind of rehearsing the classic issues of relying on economic data, or particularly on GDP. Some of the issues that I think probably everybody's familiar with are around the fact that GDP tells us nothing about distribution, for example. So it doesn't tell you anything about who benefits when GDP grows. It doesn't tell you anything about sustainability. How sustainable is that economic activity, both within itself, so can that economic activity be sustained over time, but also what does it do to the resources that we need in the long run, so things like the natural resources that help to grow our economies. Finally, GDP focuses on things that are exchanged in markets because we're good at counting those. So things like clean air, personal security, leisure, health, social relationships, we don't tend to trade those in markets, so it's very difficult to monetize them, it's very difficult to count them in the classic sense, and so it's very difficult to include them in aggregate measures of economic activity, because that's all they are, they're measures of economic activity rather than all of society's activities. Very often we call these types of things priceless, and that doesn't mean they have no value, it means precisely the opposite. They're so important to us that we cannot price them. Again, if we want to guide policy, we need to be able to think about the things that people regard as being priceless. So back in 2011, the OECD launched what's called the Better Life Initiative, and this is all part of supporting our mission of helping governments to create better policies for better lives. So one of our main objectives through this program is to add new measures of societal progress, so to broaden out our understanding of how is life going for people. An element of that is developing statistical capability and capacity, and that's the kind of core component that my team focuses on. We're trying to embed these broader metrics into the mainstream statistical system. So we're trying to get them to a level where we can rely on them, they're internationally comparable, they're robust, we can trust these data. And ultimately, the goal is to improve the evidence base that's available to policymakers so that they can look more broadly at whether they're having a positive impact on people's lives. So a key audience for us in Statistics Directorate is national statistical officers for obvious reasons, and of course, again, those fabled policymakers. But again, we are also trying to do this so that we've got the kind of data that civil society and citizens can also use. So coming back to the question, can you measure happiness? When we first started this work back in 2011, this was one of the key questions that we were asked to look at. So there was a lot of interest in subjective well-being around a lot of national statistical offices, around the research community. There was a clear kind of need for some data to work on. But the challenge was everybody was approaching the question in a slightly different way. So we had a lot of stats officers, data producers producing information and numbers about this stuff, but it wasn't always in a coherent way. We couldn't compare it across countries, for example, which is one of the key things that the OECD likes to do. But it was also important in terms of ensuring the rigor of these data. So understanding the methodology of how they're collected and what that means for how they're reported. So again, our main audience with these kind of guidelines, and we're now onto our 5th edition of the guidelines publication. So this one is about subjective well-being, but we've also written about trust, about the quality of the work environment, and a couple of different publications all about income, consumption, and wealth, and looking at joint distribution of those outcomes. So a core part of my team is this statistical capacity building, and we're aiming at sort of data producers with this, so they're quite technical, heavy documents that are designed to guide stats officers. But I think they're also quite relevant for the research community and also for other data producers, because again, as we've heard earlier on this morning, there are a lot of people in this data production space. It isn't just national statistical officers who are now the producers of data. So one of the things we're aiming for with these guidelines is, first of all, to look at what are the best possible methods as we know as things stand now, and recognizing that we're in a field that is moving very fast and is cutting edge. So taking stock of what the available evidence tells us about what good measurement looks like. But also to try and encourage countries to move towards a consensus position so that everybody's measuring things in the same way. Because generally we can learn a lot more from countries' experiences if we've got the same measures. That doesn't mean there isn't space for experimentation and creativity. That's absolutely essential too, because I think we're quite a long way from knowing exactly what the perfect measure looks like. But the point is, if we're going to understand the dynamics of these indicators, some consistency in how they're collected, both across countries, but also crucially over time and within surveys, it's really important. So how did the OECD go about defining this concept of happiness or subjective well-being? Well, we looked across a very wide literature, and there are a lot of people now working in this space, and we tried to sort of condense down what are the key components that this concept contains. So we've got this overall statement about subjective well-being being concerned with good mental states. So that includes both positively evaluating your life or components of your life, but also affective reactions. So how are you feeling, and how does that relate to what you experience? So we've identified these 3 sort of big scale core components. One is life evaluations. So this is the cognitive evaluation. How do you feel your life is going? There's this affective component, which is often talked about in emotional terms, but I think it goes beyond just emotions. So you can think of the classic emotions, happiness, contentedness, or negative emotions, sadness, anxiousness. But there are also various states that we wouldn't necessarily call emotions, but it's actually quite important to be capturing those. So things like pain, or boredom, or tiredness, for example. These are states, they're not necessarily emotions per se, although pain I think you could count as a negative, but that could be physical pain as well as emotional pain. So there's a kind of experiential component that we've called affect. A lot of people call it hedonic well-being or experienced well-being. Finally, there's this concept of eudaimonia, which I think it's fair to say in the literature is kind of one of the areas where there's the greatest diversity of approach. The idea really is to look at positive mental functioning and or people's feeling of meaning and purpose in life. And I think within the literature, there's sort of 2 camps emerging. One is on the positive mental function camp, the other is more on the meaning and worthwhile. And I think the sort of Aristotelian view of eudaimonia is more on the living a life with meaning, which is not necessarily the same as always functioning at a high level positively. So I think that this concept of eudaimonia, I think we might end up needing to break things out a bit further, but I think maybe Carol will be touching on this later on in her presentation too. So the bottom line of all of this is to say that we often use this word happiness, but we often mean a lot more than just happiness, and there's many different components to your mental states that can be important in different contexts. So I'm not going to spend too long explaining what's in the guidelines and what they do, but I will just give you an overview, which is to say that Within the guidelines, we cover off a number of different elements. So the concept and validity to show that these data are interesting and worth looking at. The methodological issues, which are quite vast, and we cover in an awful lot of detail. Good practice on data collection, so what we know at the moment about what seems to be the most valid and reliable ways to collect these data. And finally, what you need to know if you're going to be reporting and analyzing these data. So people who've worked with these data for decades in psychology are not often the people who are analyzing these data for the purposes of policy. So there's an educational pathway that we need to take some economists in particular on if they're going to be working with these data. So the measurement challenge is, I think, an important one to register. And again, I don't want to spend too long on this. The guidelines go into great detail about issues of measurement. I just want to register here, really, that like any other self-reported concept, subjective well-being is affected by survey methodology. So you do really need to think about how you're designing and constructing your instruments. Subjective well-being data are noisy, but we really do think that there is signal in there. So again, the question is, how big does your sample size need to be if you want to look at things like inequalities? How many people do you need to be measuring before you get a reliable point estimate? That aside, all measures contain error. So the solution is not to stop measuring altogether just because it's difficult. The solution is to try and understand and map those sources of error so that where possible, we can manage them through sensible survey design practice, for example. So the really important thing here, again, is to understand where that error is coming from if we're going to be able to manage it. Another big philosophical question, but again, I think one that it's really important to register in this context, can we stop at happiness? If we want to measure the progress of societies, is happiness enough? Well, I think my previous slide kind of gave a bit of a clue about the OECD position on this, which is relying on one number to tell us about the progress of society is risky. And I think if we simply shift from GDP to happiness, each of those two measures have pros and cons, and we're not moving to a perfect system. So I think an important thing to look at here is how many measures do you need if you want to capture people's experiences? Their self-reported experiences are very important. That needs to be understood. I'm saying this is very important territory. But if you really want to understand what's going on for people in their lives, I think you need quite a lot of objective data as well. Now, how you see this in a hierarchy, whether or not you think happiness is the final end goal and all of these are just determinants of happiness, that's fine too, if that's the line you want to take. But the OECD approach to measuring well-being has a variety of different components, and we think that they're all important if you want to capture what's going on for people. So as you can see, we have this framework diagram. There's two big components. There's current well-being at the top there, and there's resources for future well-being at the bottom. So under current well-being, we kind of divide it, I think uncomfortably at the moment, into quality of life and material conditions. So material conditions is the kind of classic income and wealth, jobs and earnings, housing, and then on quality of life, we've got a whole raft of different things that we think it's important to look at, from health status through to environment, through to subjective well-being. So a couple of key measurement principles. When we're looking at current well-being, we're looking at people, not the economic system. So our unit of analysis here is usually the person, household, and community level. We're looking at outcomes rather than inputs or outputs. So we're trying to capture the final things that matter to people in terms of the quality of their lives. So if I take the example of health, one of our indicators is life expectancy. That's an outcome measure, whereas something like how much you spend on health is an input. So we make quite a clear distinction between the things that go in to your outcomes and the final outcomes. And our measurement framework is very much focused on the final outcomes. Again, from a research perspective, you need to map that entire course. But the indicators that we're using to measure the progress of societies need to be at the outcome end of that spectrum. We're interested in both averages and inequalities. And as you'll see when I present some data later on, this has become a kind of really core focus of our work. And we include both objective and subjective characteristics of people's lives. On the resources for future well-being side, we've got 4 different types of capital. So natural capital being environmental resources, ecosystem services. economic capital, so that includes physical capital, so things like built infrastructure, and also financial capital, so things like money in bank accounts. Human capital is the knowledge and skills and health that people have. And social capital is about the relationships between people that help society to function. So we use this term capital that we've borrowed from economics and resonates well with economists, but people often are uncomfortable with it when we're talking for audiences beyond economists. I want to be quite clear that calling it capital doesn't mean we're monetizing everything. So admittedly, financial capital is necessarily monetized, but with all the other elements, we're looking at physical measures. We're not trying to put a dollar value on things. Within these measures, we're considering both stocks and flows, but also the risks and resilience factors associated with these different types of capitals. These are often connected to societal level outcomes rather than individual level outcomes. So this is where we get into issues like common public goods, so things that we share between us that aren't necessarily owned by individuals. And the key for this component of our framework is that this is the element that enables us to look intergenerationally. So we're looking at resources that are shared across time. Again, I'm from the stats side, so I need to talk a little bit about what we think good measures look like, and these are some of the quality criteria that we apply to the data that we use. Now, again, I should be very honest in saying that not all of our data meet every single one of these criteria. There are trade-offs and there are barriers, and there are some areas where we're dealing with data that don't, they're not perfect measures by any means, but we want to get started, and that means looking at what's out there. But for us, it's important that data are relevant, and particularly in a policy context. We need them to be accurate, so valid and reliable. They need to be credible and comparable, so that means looking at things like the source, the sample, the methodology. Timeliness and frequency is really important. Very often types of measures we're using are not collected very often, and when they are collected, it might take 2 or 3 years before they trickle into the OECD system. So part of our role is also looking at ways to get these data a little bit more frequently and a little bit more timely. We need the data to be interpretable. Again, it's kind of key for us because we're trying to reach such a wide range of audiences that people can look at these data and understand up means good, down means bad. It needs to be that simple. Some of our indicators are reverse scored, so it's not totally simple, but it needs to be clear to people whether something going up means a positive or negative thing. There are also some working constraints that we're stuck with in the OECD that actually not everybody is stuck with. So things like making sure that we got good country coverage really matters in our context. It doesn't matter in all contexts. So how does anybody use these measures? There are sort of 5 key different things that we've seen when we're looking across OECD countries. So by the way, the OECD has 36 different member countries. We have a lot of European countries, but we're actually spread all over the world. So Japan, Korea, Chile, Mexico, Turkey, got a variety of sort of non-European countries. So a lot of people think because we're in Paris, we must be a European organization, but we span globally. So one of the things that people are looking for in these measures, and one of the rationales for collecting these type of data, are to provide a more complete picture of progress. Another is to highlight inequalities. We've often seen that people find having a debate about well-being and what it means and how you measure it is quite a good way of engaging people in a conversation about what is it that you want, what is it that you need. These data can also be used to support strategic alignment across government. I think actually it's more about the frameworks and less about the data when we're talking about things like strategic alignment. And finally, data can be used to promote the appraisal and evaluation of policies to find out whether or not they work in terms of improving people's lives. So just to run through each of these individually with a few examples. I've put up here a slide showing the United States performance on our current well-being measures. So the idea of this data visualization is that this is a comparison between the United States and other OECD countries, so other developed economies. And the longer the bar, the better the outcome. So the short bars mean that the US is doing poorly relative to the rest of the OECD. The long bars mean that the US is doing very well relative to the rest of the OECD. And you can see a kind of quite strong pattern here in terms of things like income and wealth. Most of our jobs and earnings outcomes and a lot of our housing outcomes are very strongly positive in the US relative to the rest of the OECD. There are also some clear areas of weakness. So if we look at things like work-life balance, the US is doing relatively badly compared to most OECD countries. There are a couple of other pockets of problems, so things like homicides on personal security, civic engagement on the civic engagement and governance dimension, so that's actually voter turnout. Things like life expectancy. Might be surprising to people to know that actually relative to the rest of the OECD, the US is not performing well, despite actually spending by far more money per capita on health services. So this is just to say that you can get a picture overall of what's going on for people in a country when you put these data together. So one of the things I should actually say at this point is that many of these data have existed in OECD systems for 30 or 40 years. So what's new here is not necessarily always the data. Quite often things like life expectancy we've been collecting for many, many years. What's new is putting them all together to get this holistic picture of what's going on for people. Now, why is it important to take a multidimensional view? Why can't we simply rely on, say, income or jobs? One of the things we found when we look at how these data change over time is that different indicators move in different directions. So one of the things we did in our most recent How's Life report was look at what's changed relative to 2005 in OECD countries. And we can see that in some aspects of life, things have clearly gotten better. So things like life expectancy gone up by nearly 2 years. Annual earnings and income have both gone up on average, although I have to say they've not risen in the last decade nearly as rapidly as they had in the decade before. So they have moved in a positive direction, but it's been very slow. And also things like employment have actually gone up since 2005. Although, again, that's been quite a rocky picture for most OECD countries. At the same time, quite a few of our indicators have worsened since 2005. So if we look at things like labour market insecurity, long-term unemployment, social connectedness, so how supported people feel. And again, here we're actually looking at the same measure that Oberlin talked about earlier on in terms of the share of people who feel supported or that have someone to rely on in a time of need, whether that's friends or family. So it's really important to look at this multidimensional picture because these different indicators tell you quite different pictures about how life is going for people and whether things are getting better or not. Again, if we look at that in a US context and compare it to the OECD average, it's quite interesting to see, for example, gains in life expectancy in both the US and for the OECD on average. But the gains are slimmer for the US, and that means that the US is actually falling behind the OECD average since 2005. So that gap between the US and the OECD average has widened since 2005. And you can see right towards the end of our data there, this drop-off in life expectancy that I think Carol will be talking about later on, Carol Graham rather than Carol Riff. Also, household disposable income, you can see it's been a bit of a bumpy ride since 2005, but there has been this overall increase, but it's quite a slow and steady increase rather than a rapid rise. At the same time all of this has been going on, the US employment rate, you can see it falling during the early years of the crisis, and we're still not back up to the pre-crisis levels. Social support has fallen on average across the OECD, but the fall has been particularly sharp in the US. If we look at resources and risks for future well-being, so again, we have a dashboard of indicators that we're monitoring. The column of numbers there is about which tier of the OECD the US falls into. So number 1 means the top third of the OECD, number 3 means the bottom third, and number 2 is somewhere in the middle. And we're also, again, looking at change over time. So we can see, for example, that on carbon emissions, both from production and consumption, the US is in the bottom third of the OECD, so it's one of the largest emitters. But there is a slightly positive trend in terms of per capita emissions. Those are getting slightly better over time. So one of the things I mentioned is our focus on inequalities and highlighting the diversity of people's experiences. And I think this is where survey-based data have an advantage over things like digital and administrative data. So not administrative data, but data that is pulled from digital sources. Because very often when we're pulling data from digital sources, we don't know who produced those data, and we therefore can't look at inequalities in experience. So this is one where actually the classic survey data enable us to do more. So one of the key sort of motivating factors is looking at the disconnect between what's going on in the economy on aggregates and what's actually people are experiencing. So one of the things that I think most people are familiar with now is all of the work that's been done on income inequality. And if we look at 17 different OECD countries since the mid-1980s, we can see that the growth in income is very different depending on where you start. So if you're in the top 10% from income, the income growth that you've experienced is nearly 4 times that than those experienced in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. So we know about income distribution, and we've been collecting these data again for actually a very long time. Well, what about inequalities in well-being more broadly? So in our last edition of our publication, How's Life, we looked at a framework for understanding inequalities in people's well-being. So we're interested in the dispersion in terms of the gap between those at the top and those at the bottom. We're also interested in gaps between groups, so we call these horizontal inequalities, so things like differences between men and women, between young and old, between high and low educated. And we're also interested in deprivations. So if you think about a threshold level that is a kind of basic minimum, what share of the population falls below that threshold? So just very quickly, again, to give a flavor of some of these data, we can look at things like areas where education really matters for what you experience. Now, again, it won't be surprising to see that things like income and wealth vary a lot by education. That's nothing new. What is interesting, for example, though, is that things like feelings of security also vary by education. One of the interesting things in our work is also, again, this country comparison means that we can see, are you more or less equal than other countries? So again, at the top there, I've highlighted household net household wealth, because this is an area where the United States is much more unequal than the OECD on average. So you would expect differences in wealth by education, but it's interesting that that also varies very strongly across countries. There are also, for example, large differences in how long people live by education. So one of our key findings here is that if you look at the life expectancy at age 25 and the difference between people who've had a tertiary education versus a secondary education, if you've had a tertiary education, men live on average 8 years longer and women live on average 5 years longer, which is quite a striking number. Again, if we look at something like deprivation, we can see, for example, that over a third of the population in OECD countries is exposed to levels of air pollution that are considered dangerous for health. So again, if we're thinking in the context of cities and how we design cities, I think these sorts of measures are crucial. I mentioned this interest in fostering public engagement and debate, and one of the things that we've seen in a number of countries where they have started to collect well-being data is that the first thing they do is actually turn this to the population and say, well, what does well-being mean for you? What kind of indicators are we going to need to collect to capture your well-being? And I've just put a couple of countries on the slide there, but I'm not going to run through them. Again, the OECD's attempted itself to do a tiny bit of outreach to the wider community through a website called the Better Life Index. So this is where you can visit our website, have a look at all of the data that we collect on well-being, and if you want to, you can build your own index of well-being. So depending on how you rank the different components in our well-being framework, we can do a calculation and you can see then how OECD countries do on your own index. If we look at what matters most to people when they share their data with us on how they're ranking these different components, we generally see that people want to be healthy, happy, and wise. So the 3 components that come out most strongly are around health, life satisfaction, and education. But one of the main takeaways actually for me from this slide is also how important all of these elements are for people's well-being. There isn't a single element that people just say, nah, I don't need that. So while we can see a broad pattern in terms of the things that people place most value on, I think it's also fair to say that people value all of the different components of our framework. Again, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but we can also drill down at the level of countries to see how different people rank the different components of our well-being framework. One of the really important caveats I must place on this is that this is not nationally representative, high-quality data. This is data that we pull from a website, and we know it takes a very special kind of person to ever visit the OECD's website in the first place. So we know that this is a heavily biased sample. We're not suggesting that people use these data for serious policy analysis. We're just saying it's interesting to look at how this varies across countries. I mentioned this interest in the strategic alignment of government objectives. So I don't know how many kind of serious policy geeks we have in the room, so I'm not necessarily going to dwell too long on the last 2 points that I want to make. But some of the things that we have seen in terms of countries' pick up and use of these data are to try and provide some clarity over what it is the government is strategically aiming for, and then trying to get different government departments aligning around those goals. So, for example, we see this in Scotland's National Performance Framework, which has this kind of statement of purpose in the middle. It then has a set of clear objectives around the outside, and then there are 81 different indicators that they use in a performance framework that's updated live online, where you can see how is Scotland doing on all of these different measures that the government has committed to trying to improve. Similarly, we've seen in Slovenia, the National Development Strategy for 2030 was informed by an analysis of the well-being data, combined with a discussion with Slovenians about what matters most to Slovenians, and then used to develop a kind of set of high-level objectives with a series of indicators underneath them to measure performance. One of the most interesting developments we've seen recently is actually countries looking at using these indicators to inform budget processes. So in France, Italy, and Sweden, they've all got a set of indicators, a very small set of indicators that they're monitoring alongside the budget process. So at key points in the budget discussion, there is data available about well-being, and the idea is that that should inform decisions. In New Zealand, they're taking it several steps further, and they've announced that they're going to be having a well-being budget. It's going to be launched in May of this year, and they're using well-being at each stage of the process to try and use evidence to inform the decisions that they're making, because one of the strategic objectives that the New Zealand government has set is to raise the well-being of New Zealanders. So again, this brings me to a point about appraising and evaluating the impact of policy and what effect it's having on people's lives. So I have a slide here that just talks you through the New Zealand wellbeing budget process. And the idea is that at each step in the process, wellbeing evidence is used to assess whether or not spending proposals should make it through. So at the very first stage, they've been using wellbeing evidence to set a set of priorities for the budget. So they've got high-level 5 areas in which they have decided the wellbeing evidence says they need to target if they want to improve wellbeing for New Zealanders. They're then assessing spending proposals against wellbeing criteria to decide whether or not those proposals make it into the budget. And finally, they've committed to actually evaluating the impact that proposals have on people's wellbeing. So at each step of the cycle, they want to be using wellbeing evidence. And again, the way to do this is actually to embed a well-being approach into the tools that you use for policy analysis and appraisal. So for example, New Zealand have been looking at cost-benefit analysis and how they can adapt that to look at impacts on well-being. So very last couple of slides is just about what does any of this mean for the purpose of this conference in terms of the link to infrastructure. So I've covered the happiness bit, and I know that there are other experts in the room who will be covering the infrastructure bit. But just to kind of speculate a tiny bit on how this could possibly be used. The bottom line, the reason we're doing this work is to try and capture what makes for a good life. And I think you can think about that on a number of different spatial scales. So what makes for a good country to live in, or what makes for a good city to live in, what makes for a good neighborhood, for a good community, for a good home? What are the things that people need in order for their well-being to be enhanced? So the OECD, we've got 36 member countries. Our ability to kind of go down to the city level is quite limited. But one of the things we can do is look at regional disparities within countries. So we have got data, for example, for the US that enables us to drill down to the state level on average. And again, I'm very aware that there are big inequalities within states, but at the state level, we can look at where well-being is kind of highest and lowest across the different regions. So this chart is organized in terms of the size of inequalities. So we can see that there are some really big disparities in the US on things like community, jobs, and health. Really surprisingly, actually, between states, income disparities, and again, this is compared to the whole of the OECD, the difference between the top two, the top and bottom states on income is quite small in relative terms. But actually, they are big within the US. So one of the big important things from this chart to be clear is that if you're at the top of this chart, you're at the top of the OECD region. So there's 400 different OECD regions we're looking at. If you're at the bottom of the chart, you're the bottom OECD region. So that's why income here is quite compressed, because out of all OECD countries, the US has a very high average income. So I know that that finding is confusing for people who are looking at this saying, but there are huge income inequalities in the US, but this is at the state level. So Maryland actually doesn't feature on this chart because it is neither in the top nor the bottom for any of these categories. But I highlighted DC coming out a little bit in terms of, maybe no surprise, the highest level of civic engagement, but also the worst on things like safety and security. So we're looking particularly here at homicide data. We do have data for Maryland, and it probably will only be of interest to me that the shape of the distribution of Maryland's well-being is very similar to Yorkshire and Humber, which is actually the part of the UK that I grew up in. So we can, again, drill down at the state level to look at the different components of well-being. Again, I have to confess here that the data that we have at state level is not nearly as rich as we have at country level. So this is only a subset of our well-being indicators that you can see represented. But we can look at, for example, things like life expectancy and mortality rate, where relative to other states, where is Maryland performing? We can also look again, I mentioned safety as one of the areas where Maryland is doing poorly relative to other US states. But one of the patterns that we see everywhere at country level, at state level, is that there are always positives and negatives. So there are always areas where people are doing well, and there are always areas where people are doing badly. Actually, jobs and community are two areas that Maryland is doing well relative to the rest of the US. So finally, a quick mention of some experimental work that we've been doing with geospatial data to try and get a level of granularity that's even deeper. We're very fortunate that the French Statistical Office do very detailed analysis of quite a few of our well-being indicators at the city level. So we've got data, I think, for it's about 3,500 French cities, where we can look at 7 of the 11 different components of current well-being in our framework, and then start to map which are the French cities that have the highest well-being and the lowest well-being and the highest rates of deprivation across our well-being indicators. And this is something that we're quite keen to explore, both with partnering with cities, but also if there are other stats officers who've got this kind of geospatial data where we can drill down to a much deeper level. So I'm going to close it there, but thank you very much for listening, and I hope that everybody's still awake after all of that. And yeah, happy to take any questions.
Okay, questions? In the back. Oh, the microphones are on their way.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I learnt so much. My question is about the developing world. And having tried to measure subjective well-being in countries like Malawi, in India, and the stigma associated with answering a well-being scale negatively, how do you manage that in your data? And how do you think we deal with that as researchers?
So I think this is a really important question. Our data are generally from OECD countries, so it's generally the developed world. But we do a lot of work beyond OECD countries. For example, our development center is looking at non-member countries. Social desirability bias in these data is one of the things that we needed to look at quite closely. So this issue of, is there an expected answer that I'm meant to give here? And how does, for example, the survey mode influence the extent to which people are swayed by what they're expected to report? The evidence that we've seen, and I have to say it's generally evidence from developed economies, is that the social desirability bias on something like a life satisfaction question isn't high. But I think it probably is something that varies across countries a little bit. Now, there's multiple schools of thought about how you reduce social desirability. One of them is that you have kind of totally anonymized surveys delivered online so that you don't have a face-to-face interaction and someone feels that they can be honest. But another school of thought is actually that if you have a face-to-face interview and you can build rapport, you can develop much better trust and therefore be much more likely to get an honest answer from people. What I would say is that even if we're worried about social desirability in these data, they do seem to map quite closely to what we would expect in terms of people's conditions in life. So things like poverty have a major impact on where you score on things like life satisfaction. Things like whether or not you have a job, whether or not you're in good health, whether or not you have strong social connections. These all seem to be very strongly related to the outcomes that people report. So again, as I mentioned, we think that these data are noisy. There is error in these data, there's no question of that, but we also think that you can extract meaningful signal. In terms of how you manage it, I think it is a process of looking at your methodology for data collection and trying to ensure maximum trust so that people know that they can trust these data are going to be used in a legitimate and sensible way so that they feel they can be honest in their answers.
Hi, thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation. I have two questions, actually. And the first of which is, where does mental health fall into this? Like, I know you talked about subjective well-being, which I understand to be a bit different from mental health, like diagnosis and whatnot. And my second question is, with the model you had between, you talked about intergenerational components, and you talked about the model that hold on, let me just put it up really quickly. I took a picture of the slide. So in the current well-being versus the resources for future well-being, you spoke about there's some debate about that. I was hoping that you could maybe speak a bit more about what the debate is regarding those classifications or whatnot. Thank you.
Sure. So actually, with mental health, you've pointed to a giant gap in our data. And this is one that causes me quite a lot of pain because I wish that we could fill that gap. We have a dimension called health, and all that we can measure in that is things like life expectancy. We don't have internationally comparable data on mental health. So this is an area that we're really keen to develop further because, the phrase no health without mental health, we have health without mental health at the moment because of the lack of internationally comparable data. And the issue there is also around how do you get to the outcome? So one of the things you can look at, for example, is mental health diagnosis, but if you have a better mental health system that is better at reaching people, you will have higher rates of diagnosis, and that doesn't mean that there are higher rates of prevalence in the society, it just means you've got a better system for catching people and helping them. So we have a real issue around internationally comparable mental health data, but it's an absolutely crucial gap. And I think we would put it under the health component of our framework rather than subjective well-being, because I think you're absolutely correct. There is a difference between there are some people who feel that if you are at the lower end of the scale on subjective well-being, that's the same as having a mental health problem. I don't think that that's correct. And I think that you can look at subjective well-being as a spectrum from positive experience to negative experience, but you can also, for example, be living with a mental health condition, but at times be reporting high subjective well-being. So I think we do need to separate those two things out. And at the moment, it's a big gap in our data. So on the current and future well-being, I don't think there's a debate there are hundreds of measurement debates. This is a very rich area. I don't think that there is necessarily a debate about whether or not we should be looking at these two components. One of the really interesting things is whether or not these are explicitly separated out in the measurement. So if you look at something like the Sustainable Development Goals, it is a real mishmash of current and future well-being. It's also looking at inputs, policy levers, outputs, outcomes. It's combining all of those together. there are different schools of thought emerging at the country level on how to do this. So we've got several different OECD countries that explicitly separate them out and say there's current well-being over here and then there's sustainability over here, and we need to measure both because we need to understand if the current well-being we've got today is going to be sustained over time, or if we're kind of using all our resources now to maximize well-being today. But there are others who, again, just mix these two together and say, look, well-being, sustainability, this is all about better lives for people, and you don't need to make this kind of sharp conceptual distinction. So I think there's an interesting debate there about how you measure it, how you visualize it, and indeed whether or not you should be separating the two things out.
Thank you very much for your presentation. To what extent OECD is advocating, promoting this shift into happiness budget, or some of the country examples you gave, as to making it more formal, that governments should go towards that in terms of measurement of what it is they are doing and how to evaluate their policies, rather than the old, GDP framework and just looking at subsidies for one sector or doing some health or education projects here or there, as opposed to having a more holistic, it seems, approach that at least your data is pointing to.
So I think we're definitely advocating for more data. There's no question that we're producing things like these guidelines to try and encourage more data to be collected. This is all done under the umbrella I mentioned before of the Better Life Initiative, which is all supporting the OECD's mission of better policies for better lives. So if you're going to talk about better policies for better lives, you need to be really clear what better lives means, and that's where our data come in. So the end game is absolutely to feed this information into the policy process and to try and improve the evidence base on which policy is built. What I would say is that I think we're still at a really early stage in understanding the dynamics of these different indicators and how they interact with policy and what policy levers we might have to push and pull. So mapping these outcomes onto the types of activities that governments do is a really important research agenda. Because I think at the moment, we think we're getting better at understanding what we need to measure to understand how people's lives are experienced. But the next step is absolutely understanding how that links back to policy levers. And I'm always a bit suspicious when I see people kind of with an outcome-based research finding and say, and this means that policy must do this. Because I think mapping those different relationships between the levers of policy, the activities of policy, and the outcomes those generate, that's a really important step. It's well mapped in single areas, so it's well mapped in things like education. We've got a big department in the OECD looking at education policy and how you make it better. But again, this holistic picture of saying, okay, how does my policy not only impact on education, but also what does that do to people's health, for how safe they are? This kind of holistic approach. Again, it's something that we're slowly developing in our own analysis. So we're applying a well-being lens to look at specific policy issues. There's a paper that will come out in a couple of months' time on climate mitigation. We're looking at things like how do you use government procurement to raise people's well-being using this framework and taking the framework as a lens. So we are starting to embed it in our analysis, and our analysis is precisely designed to help governments make better decisions. But I think we're still in the early stages of making that application.
Great talk, Carrie. Really well put together. What I'm reflecting about here is something that I wonder if you think about, and that is we have in many of the countries that you cover in your report, we have another version of government-supported national studies. National longitudinal studies. I lead one in the U.S. There are, many. And what I'm struck by is how little, at least from where I sit, little interchange there is between what the national statistics operation that exists in multiple countries. In many ways, we're all aiming for the same long-term objectives to understand factors that influence people's health and well-being as they age, but we don't actually interact with each other that much. I mean, do people in your world ever talk about, so for example, there's a lot of research based on national data that is linking indicators of well-being to all kinds of outcomes, morbidity, mortality, whatever. It sits in the scientific journals. It's not been generated by national statistical operations, and it just feels to me like there should be a lot more interaction and back and forth between these different worlds that are generating lots of data intended to, I think, address some of the same issues, but they don't talk to each other. Do you have that perception?
I definitely have that perception. I think it's a classic problem in terms of evidence-based policy.
Yeah.
It's always getting the vehicles to get the research into the hands of decision makers. Yeah. I think well-being can help with this issue. One of the reasons I think it can help is this point about strategic alignment. Yeah. So trying to get different people coming from completely different disciplines to work together and say, hey, actually, if I'm going to understand people's experiences, I need your kind of data in my study, and you need my kind of data in your study, to get to the point where we've got this holistic picture. So I think there's a component of this that is about different disciplines learning from each other and actually generating the data that we need. So you mentioned there is amazing work done with longitudinal studies, and very often, depending on who set them up, there are enormous gaps in them. So you might find that health outcomes or psychological well-being are really well measured in those studies, but the income measure is frankly crap. So how do we get people in these different worlds together so that you can look at income and health and education, and these are all high-quality data? Because if you can do that, you can start to talk to a variety of different policymakers with your results, rather than just the one policymaker that's interested in the outcome that you measured well. So I think there's big opportunities here for improving the research base and making it more useful to policymakers. How do we get that channel flowing smoothly? I think that's an age-old question, and well-being is not necessarily going to solve it, but I do think well-being can help. Thank you so much. Thank you.